Hello and welcome to the Redwood Finance Podcast. Today's subject is a big one. It's closing the books in a pandemic, the challenge of a forced remote month-end close. So an awful lot to unpack there. I'm writer and editor Tony Hallett, and joining me today is Adrian Li, who's a finance transformation expert. Hi Adrian, how's it going?
Hi Tony, all good. How's things with you?
Yeah, all things considered, pretty good, and looking forward to this discussion as it's a meaty one.
Indeed.
So we've got a lot to get through. I wanted to, as a way of scene setting, just talk about a few things here, because today's theme is very much about the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and then an aspect of business which is all about CFOs and their teams. Now we know that usually the close of any period can be a pretty chaotic time. I know you're vastly experienced in this area, and we've got a lot that we can bring to the table. But especially now, because what we've seen is coronavirus, the whole pandemic has turned everything on its head. And not only has it been a big few weeks, but coming at the end of March, this was also the end of a quarter for an awful lot of organizations. So particularly challenging. So we're going to be talking about the traditional challenges of the manual, what's hands-on, and really how finance teams can get on with things and comply with their reporting deadlines. And I guess also whether this is the new normal for many months ahead or indeed the future in general. So Adrian, if you could kick us off and just set us up by saying, what does a close typically look like for most companies?
Okay, yeah. So the close typically consists of executing thousands of tasks across hundreds of companies in as structured and methodical a manner as possible. Typically involves hundreds of staff across shared service centres and finance teams. But much of the work really involves proving the integrity in the numbers and therefore finding errors and posting journals for items that need to be either adjusted or corrected at period end. Issues in upstream processes create problems for finance, such as incomplete intercompany transactions, and adjustments due to errors in asset values. So it's all of these types of tasks that need to be performed at month end to make sure the numbers provide a complete, accurate and valid picture of how the business is doing. Now, clearly there's a heavy reliance on manual processes, and Excel as a spreadsheet platform figures quite extensively in the work that the finance teams do. But getting through the close is as much about hard work and dedication of the finance team and diligence, because a lot of the processes are actually in people's heads as well. They're not, in my experience, not particularly well documented. So, there's
an awful lot there, isn't there?
Yeah,
there's so much complexity, and it's vast, and it's often many units and subsidiaries reporting up into headquarters and central teams. And I know this is a big area of experience for you. So I want us to just to think about, as I say, the last few weeks. And outside of China, it's really been in Western Europe and North America. It's been through the month of March that we've started to see the lockdowns causing a lot of home working and remote working. What would have been the first reaction for a lot of CFOs and their teams having to make that change very, very quickly in some circumstances?
Yeah. So I guess a one-word answer is shock, isn't it? It's,
right.
That would have been the initial reaction, both from a business perspective, but also on a personal level as well. And I think that shock, certainly from a business perspective, would have been to do with the sort of significant reliance on manual processes and people in the close. And the question would have been, how do we get through this, given that firstly, I don't know who's working, where they're working, what access to technology they have. So really some difficult challenges there playing out. And of course, the health and safety of the CFO's team as well would have been first and foremost in their minds too.
Will they have had plans for this? I mean, because every organization has business continuity plans, but normally not for something quite like this.
It's a good question. I think the vast majority of companies will have done some level of contingency planning, not necessarily for a pandemic of this kind, but certainly for things like floods and bad weather. So, but that planning will not have extended to the same level of issues we're seeing here around, thousands of employees and staff working at home. The challenges around what technology those workers have at home, what circumstances they have, and how effective are they going to be at home working. I know from personal experience that a number of people I engage with locally, companies have been trying to test very quickly, even just basic things like, can they get video conferencing working for everybody at home so they can still be effective to some extent. But I think the vast majority of companies will have done some preparation, but nowhere near sufficient for the situation we find ourselves in right now.
And what you're describing, whilst some of those, say, natural disasters, whilst they can be very large scale and obviously horrific in their own right, they're not global by their very nature. So you've got teams in all different parts of the world who are kind of equally affected. But having said that, I know one of the things we've talked to you about in the past is how this is not quite uniform, is it, around the world? You've got slightly different conditions in different countries, some places going on lockdown earlier or for longer than others. How does that play into this?
Yeah, again, that's another interesting point. When we talked about the preparations, you're absolutely right. There may have been preparations done in, say, operations in the shared service centres in, say, the Asia Pac region, for example, where, they have the hurricane seasons and so on. But to have this, everybody working from home and locked down in entirety is one thing. But then for it to actually kick in at different times just adds to the complexity of how this was going to be handled, because you've almost got a lack of foundation there to provide a team to do the work and to get through the processes that need to be done at month end.
Tell us about the most critical crunch points for CFOs who are trying to close the books in this new, totally remote world.
Yeah, I think the crunch points, and there's quite a few of these, but I think the key ones are around how do you manage a team and their interactions, particularly because there's a lot of handoffs and handovers in finance processes. Person A does a task and then hands it on to person B, and person B then maybe gets some advice and guidance from somebody in the business, and it then goes back to person A. So those handoffs and handovers where you're working as part of a team in a structured and cohesive environment where you have all of the technology you need, it's just about doable in that environment. But where everybody's working at home, and maybe you've even got people off through illness with the virus.
Sure.
It just adds to that level of complexity and challenge that you have. So that lack of visibility of who's working on what, are they working, are they not, really allows the CFO to a lack of understanding of how the month end is going to work, and certainly a challenge on timescales. Now, I think the other thing that's balancing against that is there have been a huge surge in demand for finance people's time to answer questions in the business, to get involved in some of the government schemes that have been launched by various governments around the world for business loans and for subsidy of workers' salaries and so on. So I think at the same time as the core challenges we're talking about here, there have been a massive increase in demand on finances time during this period as business tried to understand what the impact of the circumstances might be on them.
So it's not just the difficulty of the new setups, but actually even more demand than usual at the same time as this. So it's kind of double whammy. And just for the benefit of people who are thinking about how their peers in other organizations do this, are there any large companies out there that ever out of choice have done this remotely previously and might be an advantage now? Or is it's just standard, it happens in offices, doesn't it, in back offices and service centers?
It does very, very much so, yeah. If you look at the shared service center model, for example, it is about having shared service center operations in certain locations where you have hundreds or thousands of seats, And quite often big organizations run shifts as well with staff. So you'll have multiple shifts. So it's about getting as much work through each of the seats in the shared service center as possible. That tends to be one of the key metrics. And of course, in this environment, that's impossible to measure and manage.
Okay, so thinking about what you're seeing in this new world, what have some CFOs and organizations started to do to tackle? So if you maybe you can mention a few of the challenges and some of the solutions that we're seeing to those. And yeah, is this repeatable for most other organizations?
Yeah, I think as we discussed and said that many large organizations have moved more towards this shared service center model. And that to some extent has laid some of the foundations for remote teams to work together and to collaborate. Not so much lots of home workers collaborating, but more remote teams working together. So some of that technology is around things like cloud solutions and video conferencing technologies. These have helped teams connect and stay connected with the process and the data they need. I think the other thing we would see that CFOs have had to adapt processes to work slightly differently to accommodate the working arrangements that have been forced upon us by the pandemic. That's not been without its challenges as well, because a lot of the processes in finance, particularly around the close, are often in people's heads and not documented. So it can be quite challenging and risky to change a process where you don't really understand what the business as usual process looks like. So that's another dimension to this. I think the other thing is, from a sustainability point of view, is how sustainable is this in the face of an extended lockdown? I think there's a couple of impacts here. Firstly is the sort of personal situation of the workers at home. With schools closed, childcare is a challenge for some. The mental health impacts of an extended lockdown of many months, and how that affects sort of work-life balance. So I think there's a number of considerations here, but certainly some of the technology changes that have been made as a consequence of moving to a shared services model have helped to an extent with the current situation.
And if some organizations aren't so advanced in some of those changes, and we tend to think about things like cloud as having been around for a very long time now, but if someone hasn't made that leap, are you seeing, is this the catalyst? Are people able to have to quickly fit in those changes now?
I think there are tactical changes that can be made to put a sticking plaster over the problems in the short term, but the long-term solution has to be more of a strategic assessment and transformation of the way that companies operate in order to develop the resilience that's needed.
We tend to have heard a lot of people saying they've fitted in 3 years of business transformation in 3 weeks, but there's a little bit of hyperbole to that, perhaps. So as you say, that can be more tactical than the big strategic shifts that are needed.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think some of the things that are needed as well are maybe sort of one of a kind type things. So an example might be cash flow forecasting. If you're struggling to get paid by your customers for stuff that you've already delivered or services you've provided, that task of maybe doing hour by hour or day by day cash flow forecasting is not the norm. So you've got some of these additional new processes that have been needed because of the situation we're in as well.
Okay. So to finish up, this difficult question really, but can you think of the one thing or the most important action that CFOs should be taking or have in mind at this point in time?
Yeah, I think it's really developing more resilience in their processes, and the way to do that is to rebalance work between people and, let's say, automation technologies, which are going to eliminate one of the single points of failure, if you like, in a lot of these processes, which is the fact that a lot of the work is manual, it's in people's heads. It's heavily reliant on tactical technologies like Excel spreadsheets. So I think that need to rebalance work and to make it more sustainable through technology is the single most important thing that will be on the CFO's agenda beyond this pandemic.
Okay, that is really insightful. I mean, there's a lot going on here, and we're going to be unearthing more of this in future podcast episodes. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot on CFOs' plates, but also the wider finance teams, and this is very distributed by nature. Technology is part of the answer here, but not the only thing. There's a lot you talked about in terms of process, what's in people's heads, how teams work together. And whilst there are some short-term, very important things that people can do, there's also a much bigger strategic, longer-term transformation question, which is in many ways been there for a lot, predates the current pandemic, but is really focusing minds right now.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. So Adrian, I really just want to thank you so much for this contribution, and I hope to see you again in future upcoming episodes. To all our listeners, I just want to say, please stay across this conversation at the redwood.com website, and please check out the links accompanying this podcast for other relevant assets, which will hopefully help in some way at this very difficult and unique time. That's all for this week. I've been Tony Hallett and Adrian Li. Again, thank you so much.